Stan Rule. I'm a retired pediatrician, a retired Thanksgiving, and for the last 2.5 years I've been playing amateur historian or anthropologist like Barker in the back. But just on this project to learn about the camps on the banks. And it's a process of learning because everything you find, they lead you to find other. If you follow a track and they say, oh, you need to talk to this person, so you can't ever finish. But I'll tell you how this got started. For me, Charles Perry Tyler from Atlantic came in. He came to my shop and asked me would I help put together some decoys he had from the 60s. And they had some big geese decoys that were from a camp on the banks. And he started telling me about his camp, and it was clear how much he loved that camp. And he and his wife had spent their honeymoon there. And he told me about the community there. So I started calling around to the museum and to the Park Service and said, well, tell me, where can I find more about those camps? And they said, oh, we don't have anything about it. And I talked to people like David Soselsky and other folks that have done local research. So people know, almost everybody will know something about a camp or some camps, but nothing's been pulled together. So it sort of perked my interest. And then the more stories and information I get, the more I like looking into it. So that's why I got interested into it out of the blue. And the common thing that's passed on through the Park Service, no fault of theirs, was by word of mouth. When they came in, they were told by Congress to make this back into a wilderness, so we would have as pristine a shore as we could have, so people could see what it was like. So when they were doing all of that, getting the cars and things off, taking down structures, buying back things, they weren't really. They had a few people come in and do some history, but they did very little personal interviews and pulling things together. And we are having a gradually decreasing number of people who have access to firsthand information. And so my interest, I live in a house that was flooded to Beaufort after the Exodus. People lived. Let me back up. So the banks, in 1585, there was a group of about 85 or 90 Indians living at the Cape that some of the explorers met, and they called the Cape Croatan. And they were a tribe, they called themselves Croatan, and they weren't connected to other tribes not sure who they connected to. And in 1731, there were the British warship, I'm having to blank about the name now, but anchored at Cape Lookout and drew a map, and it showed whaler huts on the ocean-facing shore. And so there had been early presence of mankind out there, mostly coming and going for subsistence. And then people who have grown up here, I'm from Alpha, grew up north of Winston-Salem, been here since '83, but y'all know better probably than me that we had between 400 and 500 people living at Diamond City and Wade Shore back before the turn of the century, and then the bad hurricanes hit at the end of the 1800s, and they had their exodus, and then their exodus took them to the Promised Land, and a few to Beaufort, but a lot to Harkers Island, that they moved their homes and moved their lives there. And so there's been a presence there. They were whalers, fishermen, and they had pretty vibrant life there. So when they exited, that's where I started seeing the whole of history, because people have tried to document about Diamond City and the history of there before. And so starting around the turn of the century, after people had exited, I think David Stick said something like, I'm gonna paraphrase, but he said when people left over there to at Diamond City or Lookout Woods, and they had to move, they tended to go back. They tried to keep a foothold on the banks, and they had a foothold on the mainland. And I would say they had the heart over the Sound. So they were connected early on in the century, but some Collier Cobb, National Geographic showed you can pass. This is to be passed around. Look at, but in the late 1800s and very early 1900s, they would build out of the reeds. They would build shacks to be there seasonally for fishing, and the people would come. They'd be farming during farm season, but they'd move down, come down here, become part of a crew, get a share of what they got. So one of the earliest camps were the one of these on Shackleford stayed intact and was used over and over for 10 years. The folks who were on Harkers Island seemed to be even early on before World War II were more connected than anybody else with the banks. They would live on Harkers Island, but they go over there to clam and oyster and fish. And Barbara, if there's something I say wrong that you know about, you can jump in because this is somebody from off. But they were before World War II. There are stories of people keeping camps there, and they would go over there and fish. Of course, early in the century, they fished out of sailboats or very putt type engines, so they couldn't run back and forth like a speedboat, and if they needed to check their nets at night and things. So there's a culture before World War II of people keeping a camp there to hunt out of, to fish out of, to spend time in, and so there's a smaller number of camps there at that time, and have been able to find some information about Joel Hancock's family. I think had a place there, and Wilson Davis had a camp there in the early 1900s that he would take his family or take some of the kids over and they'd hunt, and so there was a connection there in the early 1900s, and I'm talking about Shackleford. And let me back up again, since I'm not used to giving talks. The story of the banks is not one story. It's a story that varies about where the area is and what time it was. Because after World War II, people started using Shackleford like as an extension of Harkers Island. But William Binney, who invented crayons, built a camp just across from the Shell Point. And in the early 1900s, he had a big camp there. The Charlotte Outing Club bought land. They were going to build a facility there to bring people from their school to do outings. Because back then they didn't. You couldn't just get on a plane and go for vacation. So it was like groups of people who wanted to camp and do adventures. They went on to be the Sierra Club, not the Charlotte Club, but the outing clubs in America. And then going up the banks further, so we have people who were using the camps, some to hunt, some for subsistence for their job and their fishing and their clamming. They go over different times a year to be together on Shackleford. If you go to the Cape had till I think 1916 the post office closed, but till then there was still a small community there, and there had been a pretty good community there. But it was people were leaving there as the lighthouse automated, and they closed the post office and things like that. The people who were at the Cape, starting in like they were building the jetty in 1915 or so, but in the 1920s, 1928, 1929, 1930, people who were successful in their career, like people who had the Coca-Cola franchise, the guy who started Carolina Telephone and Telegraph, really successful farmers. They started buying and building properties around the Cape for a getaway. Before that time and after that time, even while they were there were people who had fishing camps because they would go over, set their nets, come in, rest in the camps, and go out. So there was a mixture of really nice, well-to-do people, so there were getaway vacation spots and work spots around the Cape. And then going north of the Cape became hunting territory. And then as the banks narrowed down, the hunting camps were closer to the Cape side. Then going further, we got up to the Coast Guard base across from Atlantic, and there was some hunting camps up there, and also some people had, there was a reclusive lady that lived, I haven't been able to find her name, that lived near the end. Going up, there were 2 fishing camps where the people would take, ferry people across and would let them fish on the shore, and that had maybe 100 nice to makeshift places for them to stay. And there was a community at Wibbs Creek where Charles Styron's place was that had like 14 or 15 homes. And then you go further, the Pilotary, where President Roosevelt went to hunt, and a well-to-do, the Mott family from New York had their camp there. And still going forward, you go, there were hunting camps, there were big, the island is widening out, there's getting to be more brush and trees, so then that went into being more hunting, and then you get to Portsmouth. So it was used for, getaways, hunting, fishing, but it all changed after the World War II. Portsmouth, Diamond City, Cape Lookout, and a few people on Shackleford. Those were communities that were still there early in the 1900s, and then after World War II, people started connecting back there. So, and obviously, I have more information about people who were living that time than I do people before. So, just as and anybody, you can stop me with any question, because your questions will probably be more interesting than what I come up with on my own. But one of the stories that I was intrigued with, being a doctor and living right a short ways from where he lived and practiced, it was the story of Dr. Moore. Dr. Laurie Moore had a camp that was used during World War II. It was built in 1935 and was built in World War II for the Coast Guard patrols, coastal defense patrols. So they would have people, they had a house, and every night, every 2 hours, they would walk in a shift. 2 guys would go each direction. Two guys would be resting. They'd come back. They switch the shifts and rotate all through the night. Because people who have been here longer than me, they probably talked. There were accounts of people hearing folks speaking German on the banks. That submarines were up close to shore. And but anyway, his camp was built in 1935. The Coast Guard used it for their space. And this is Dr. Moore. And what's kind of neat about him was that he was, if somebody came in the office and their kid needed a pair of shoes, he'd go in his pocket and give them a wad of money and tell them to go buy shoes. And he paid one of my friends first year of college. He just was connected as a great guy and was beloved. At this camp, this is a picture of his camp that's over on the banks.
Does the Park Service use that now, that camp?
That none of these things exist now.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, in your mind, think about how many camps were up and down the banks. And pick a number, and I'm going to tell you it was 400. And I found information for 100 on Shackleford. But 400 when the Park Service took over, not counting what was there before. Everybody else seen this?
Was that 400 count places like that?
Yes, it count. So it counts really all the structures that were there. So including some of the things at Portsmouth. I don't know what the true number was. You know, like because there'll be surveys that say there were 50 places on Shackleford, and I'll find that there were 60, or the News Times says there were 279 good structures and 66 condemned structures on Shackleford. So I think they were wrong, and they probably were talking about the whole Park Service. But so you get some different values. But it was the lowest I've ever seen number quoted was 340 structures at the time they took over. And so Dr. Moore would go over there to get away, and he'd get up in the morning with his coffee, and the patients would be lined up on the porch. they knew where he was, and they'd go find him. His daughter, I don't remember her maiden name, but Judy Spitzbergen ran a program over there, taking kids from I never heard of this, being a pediatrician practicing here. Starting in the 4th grade, they were teaching kids marine science, and as they got further along, they started taking them on field trips over there, to the juniors and seniors, field trips to the banks, and they used Dr. Moore's camp and German Holland's camp. This is German Holland's camp. He was one of our sheriffs and city councilman at different times, and let's pass that, we said a different direction. They used that as a dormitory, and these kids had to do research projects, and one of them was chosen by the governor to give his research project report at West Point. And so it went from the 4th grade to seniors, and and they had a comprehensive book reporting about how they did, and it sort of went away. And this is Edna's place. Now inside you can see it's got sheetrock and finishing curtains. So these were not just old shanty shacks. They were.
I can tell you something funny about Dr. Moore. I'm from down east, so when I grew up, all 4 doctors on Front Street were from down east. Dr. Moore, Dr. Salter, Dr. Vulture, and I can't even think of the 4th one now. But Dr. Moore would make house calls down east, and if he saw anybody's light on at night, he'd stop and ask them if everything was okay, so he wouldn't have to come back.
Yes.
So he would check on them to make sure, because most people were not up late at night, so if he saw a light, he figured something was wrong in their household. So,
And the Heslop is nurse is the other house we're looking at, and he would sometimes send her ahead down east to say, "You go down there and see him first, and I'll be down later." And she would try to do what she could, but
I remember as a child, my mother took my grandmother, and she had a bad heart, and his office was upstairs.
Yep.
What was the old Beaufort Hospital.
yes, ma'am.
And he came down to the car and he'd check her out, and she said, "Dr. Moore, what do I owe you?" And her name was Melinda, and everybody called her Aunt Nan. He said, "Aunt Nan, you don't owe me a thing." He said, "As many children as you've got, I'll get it back." That's right.
And sometimes he would take the pay and have somebody bring. I think his wife didn't like to make oysters or in the house, and so he'd tell him, "Well, you just sneak me a batch of oysters down here sometimes."
And the Pillsbury's, my grandmother's brother was the caretaker there. And my mother said that 1 week out of the summer, she got to go there and visit with her cousins, and she loved it because they had a library, they had horses, they had everything. But his children hated it because their mother would take them the day school ended, and they stayed on the banks until the day school started in the fall. The mother loved it because she had a big holiday.
And which character? Who was he? Do you remember his name?
Willie Mason.
Yep.
The picture of Garden Holland cabin has, you see electric lines that had electricity over there at that time?
Those were telegraph and telephone lines. So they between the Coast Guard stations, they had lines so they could communicate. So if something happened, they could get people coming from both ends.
It's okay.
So the Pillow-Terry is, like I say, is where President Roosevelt, I'm going to jump around a little bit since you brought it up, where this is a picture of President Roosevelt when he was Secretary of Defense, getting in a cart, and Avon Mason, his brother, or
No,
uncle,
they weren't brothers. They,
uncles,
Ah.
they were related, but
yeah.
yeah, they were in the same family. And Jordan Mott was his business was a foundry. He made like cast iron stoves and washed bathtubs, things like that. His wife loved to go to Europe and be around all the well-to-do people there. You know, and as far as I know, he was a nice person. I don't obviously I don't know a lot. He loved to do watercolors while I was in the hunting blinds. Yeah, that'd be right. Yeah. And so he did a watercolor. If you find something about the Pillow-Terry, here's a watercolor of the Pillow-Terry, and if you go around looking, you'll see it in books. It was washed away. That's what was left after the '33 storm. And this picture, I've seen it in books from the Mott family history, and I went into the history place one day, and that original's on the end of one of the bookcases. They didn't know, but that's Jordan Mott's original watercolor is over at the history place. But it was as you said, it was as Clay Fulcher told me about the Pillow-Terry. That was his family. The Masons were his mother was a Mason. He said, "Yeah, this table we're sitting at is the same one Roosevelt sat at." So he had that and across from in the kitchen.
So what's Pillow-Terry mean? I don't know that word.
So Pillow-Terry is a shrub with thorns, and if you chew the leaves, it make your teeth go numb. It's called the Hercules Club, in a nickname, but it's a Pillow-Terry bush. And so they named it after because a lot of those bushes were there, and at least I'm assuming that that's how they named it because there's nothing said about that. But that's what Clay thought about it. But the story of the Pillow-Terry is a big story starting in right after the Civil War. James Mason, who's the ancestor, was buying land on those core banks for 25 cents an acre from the state, and I found the deed for that.
It's hard.
And he built a house there, and he fished out of a schooner and took things up river with the schooner. And there's a small book called The Voyage of the Paper Canoe. A guy who wanted to go from the Great Lakes or up New York all the way to the Gulf in a canoe, and he made it with wood ribs, but he made it out of paper. And he stopped and stayed with James Mason, and then he went over to Atlantic they had 3 weddings on one day, and so that book talks about him being there. Yeah. So I think James Mason moved to the hammock house, and Augustus Mason, one of his sons, got a house behind it. There's some pictures in. I'm not sure if it's Mary Warshaw's stuff, but I've seen the picture of an old picture of the hammock house, and they'll say Augustus Mason house behind it. Going back to Shackleford, one of the reasons I brought some pictures of kids is that I was talking to the Nashes who had a place at the Cape. They said, when we got our place at the Cape, they got a 25-year lease near the end. He said, my 10-year-old, my 13-year-old, my 15-year-old were all starting into the black tunnel of adolescence, and the Cape saved them. He said, made them salty. And but over and over again, I hear, like, this is Mark Hooper. A lot of you know Mark. He was staying at Edna's camp and putting his, as you're not supposed to do now, putting his trying to think what was the girl, Edith, on top of one of the wild ponies. And on the back, some of you will know Chris Sabiston, and that's Chris Sabiston walking with his son, Gray, walking down the beach, hugging his sons, talking. You're away from other things, and you had time with your family. You know? So there was a folks say, well, if we're here, we're going to get groceries, we're running errands, but if we're over there, we socialize, we do things that were more wholesome. And the kids were a little bored at first, but then they would learn to be free. They couldn't go too far. You could find them. And they learned to be independent, to help look after the cabins. They learned the type of character building things about, personal growth that's there. And so over and over again, I hear that they love the fellowship, the closeness with family, what you could pass on to the kids. This was Wayne Davis's. He called his the sand trap, and he was near the horse pens on Shackleford, and we're all spending a lot of time on Shackleford, but we got to spend it on something like this. And that was on one side of this. You can see an aerial view of the horse pens. Every year they would run the horses down from one end. The horses would come up against a fence, and they would have to run down it. They'd actually end up in a corral. And then they go to the other end of the island and run them down. Well, that's a picture of the horse pens. And then just west of the horse pens, several hundred yards, was a place called Bell's Island that was 14, 15 homes in a cluster in that one area. And it got to be so many people there that the locals started calling it Little Miami. But, yeah. So one of the first people I talked to was Emma Rose Guthrie. She was going to be here today. It would be better to hear her talk about how much she loved that camp. She said that she would have rather they had burned her house than to keep her camp. But her family, Telford and Hetty Rose, lived at the Cape till the 19 teens. And so she spent a lot of time going back over there to the Coca-Cola house, or they had a shed. They had a shack that one of the folks would let them use on the beach at the Cape. But eventually she got a place that this is a drawing and then artwork. And you'll find out that people loved their camps so much that they, in their homes, had watercolors and artwork about it. They were precious to them. And then this is the picture of it before and then after it was burned, or while it was burning. She said she was coming across the North River Bridge and she could see 3 plumes of smoke. She said, "Oh my God, they're burning my camp today," and they were. So. But that was after it was acquired, and they totally was going to burn. It doesn't make it feel better.
We used to watch them look across the corner and see them.
Yeah. And they still did that with Casablanca this year and a half ago. So this is James Moore, and this is the last wedding. So we talked about somebody having their honeymoon, but this is the last wedding on Shackleford. James Moore did that. We'll get away from that. So this is an artist's rendition of Casablanca, or the Baker Holderness house. It was built in 1929. It's gone now. This is a picture of it. This is them inside playing cards. Playing cards was a big deal about this, the Holderness family, because George Holderness bought the jetty. The jetty workers were building the jetty in 1915, and George bought that. He got the deed from the land company, the development company, and from Carl Josenhans, who had built it. So he had the deed to it, and he built his place in 22. And during a poker game, he lost it to Mr. Foxall from Tarboro. his family eventually goes on and buys a share of Casablanca. The people who built Casablanca was R.W. Baker and Penelope. And if Ms. Edmund was here, she would say Miss Penelope was one of the sweetest people because she knew her before the war. When she was a little kid, she'd get play. There was artesian well spurting water, and all the kids would go over and play. And this is the jetty workers' house that George Holderness lost in the poker game.
Oh, yeah.
He's born.
Jimmy Bourne's dad.
Jimmy.
Jim Long.
Jim.
Jim Bourne.
Okay, so if you know the Bournes,
Yes, we do.
so Joe Bourne, he loved the Banks. Joe, the son Bourne, he writes for National Geographic. He's a well-respected, he's a successful writer, and he's writing a memoir about this camp.
Someone,
What do you know about, excuse me,
I want to get your email address. I want to have somebody to ask you
Yeah.
1,000 questions.
I'd be glad to, yeah.
what do you know about the cabins across from Davis that were the Sterling Dixon cabin?
We'll get there.
Okay.
Sterling Dixon was the first person, right? But let me tell you this about Casablanca. I was so tickled to find, and I communicate with her now. Melissa Moy, she says on her biographical page, she says, as I looked out over the rising sunlight, I'm paraphrasing, I was watching for the migratory birds to come back as they did every year, worrying that they wouldn't make it back. And I was so delighted to see them come in. That time, those times at our camp on the Banks formed the direction of my career. She's the global finance director for World Wildlife Fund. So, and as I said, the Carolina Power Telephone Telegraph people, Jefferson Pilot people were all in the Holderness Casablanca group. And then this is just again to show about family gathering at a simple cabin. This was so Haywood Holderness loved that place, and he loved the movie Casablanca. So it was the Baker House till they sold it before the war. Well, they sold it right after the war. And so when the Holderness and the Moys got it together, he named it that after his favorite movie. So it's called Casablanca by most people nowadays, but it's really Baker Holderness' house. But this is the Hansons who live in Gloucester. And this is their cabin that they had up on the dune out near the point of the bike, near the exit from the bike. And this is just showing that the Longs would fly in there.
Yeah.
You know, Wiley was a pilot
In the Second World War.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so so they would fly in. Of course, they played baseball on the same flats that they landed the airplanes, so they'd have to get out of the way. And I'm going to diverge and tell you, you can go on YouTube and look up 1966 Chevrolet commercial. In 1966, they took Brother Gaskell and Manly Gaskell were pitching baseball out on the Banks, and Brother said, "Did you see that?" A car went by with no noise. Of course, all the mufflers on the other cars were loud. He said, it was a brand new car and it didn't make any noise. Man said, just pitch the damn ball. And they rode it up and down the beach a couple times, put it on a sand dune and blew it up to make a commercial on Cape Lookout. And the theme was, let's make a big impact. It was like to stimulate their salesmen. So they blew up a brand new 66 Chevrolet out on the Banks of the Cape. And if you go on YouTube and put 1966 Chevrolet commercial Cape Lookout or Fort Macon, and then it'll say at Fort Macon, Georgia, but it's Fort Macon. Anyway, that's an aside. Okay. But it was such a treat. Mr. Hanson told me that, and Brother could tell me about what had happened. So I'm not talking a lot about the Cape right now. We're going forward, some of the camps, hunting camps they're going north. They started being hunting camps again. This is James Davis. If we go right 2 doors down, I think James Davis's, Jim Davis's place is there. This is Seagirt. It had, in the later years, it had solar power, wind generators, electric generator, hot water, all that. It was a well-done camp, and some of the other camps were not as well done. This is Dallas Lewis's camp, and this is showing where on the bay it is. But the main thing is it had a table, 2 chairs, and a bunk bed. That's all it had, and they were right side by side. So really, so going further up, if we get on up to Sterling Dixon's place, Sterling Dixon started would ferry people across, and later he had a bunch of camps until he started having heart disease. He had a bunch of camps right where the ferry dock came in, and then Alger Willis had a few camps down to the right, south, and Carly Willis had a few camps to the north, and then Marvin Murphy had a few camps just off to the right of the bay, but Sterling Dixon had the most camps there, and he started having heart trouble, and he sold his camps to Alger Willis, and so that's why now everybody thinks of where the big camp is Alger's, because that's what's been most recently. But this is just a picture of folks going down the banks. Look at that car, that's pretty neat. But the best car out there would be an A model, because they wouldn't get stuck, or everything was simple, not many moving parts. These are some camps. Like I say, there were hundreds of camps out there. So if there were 400 camps, the Park Service took off over 3,000 cars. There were, if I remember correctly, there were hundreds and hundreds of cattle, sheep, goats, and horses all up and down the banks. One of the guys at Portsmouth, their family's house got one of the Salters. Their house got messed up in the 33 storm, so they moved to the mainland. But they kept the land, and he decided he wanted to herd of horses. So he went to Kennekeet. You know where that is? Went to Kennekeet. He and a friend bought 25 wild ponies, started driving them down the banks. And his friend had to leave, so he had to do it by himself. Every time he'd get to an inlet, he'd run the horses into the water. He had one mare that would do whatever he would follow his direction, and the other horses would follow her. He'd ride his horse, and when the water got deep, he'd slide off the saddle, grab the horse's tail, and the horse would carry him till he got shallow on the other side. And he went across every inlet down to Portsmouth with those 25 ponies. So that. You can see, like, I have fun hearing the stories about the things that this is another camp that's at the edge of the Dixon camps. There were, like I said, I would say 100 cabins, and some of them were really, you wouldn't want to stay in, and some of them were really cute. And there's a guy named, I think it's George Sheets, but his last name was Sheets. He'd been fishing down that way since before World War II, and he was known to be like the best drum fisherman. He could catch a drum even if his lure didn't make it to the water, he said. And Ted Williams was stationed at Cherry Point, and Ted Williams heard about him and flew his cub, he and one of his friends, and flew up and down the beach till they could find him fishing with somebody with a bunch of fish laid out. Ted Williams landed his plane and had him start teaching him how to fish for drum. They fished together for years and years. He was a Winston-Salem guy, he wasn't a Reynolds guy. But so Ted Williams was over there, Babe Ruth, Ted Zachary, who had a whole season in the pros without losing a game pitching. Sam Sneed was a member of the Rod and Gun Club that was, and Bob Timberlake used to go over here a lot. So, like, but the real beauty are the local stories. You know, so it's like nice to say, oh, a big name, but when you hear these stories about somebody with their ponies or somebody being inspired for their career, or how much Emma Rose Guthrie loves to write, and she writes poetry and stories about her time there. And when I read this, you know, I never get tired of going to see her. The Rod and Gun Club was built in. They started building it in the late 1800s. It was finished in early, like 1902. And Amy Paul, who's I'm a decoy carver, and your son's a decoy carver. A lot of people rent Steve's a decoy carver. So there are a bunch of people who love decoys, and David. And but Amy Paul was the first caretaker of this camp, and is super famous for his decoys. The 33 storm was so bad that a lot of the people from New York started pulling out, and they reformed it, and it started to be more people from, successful people from Greensboro and around. This is a picture of the first camp, because the first camp, which was besides the Pillsbury, this was the nicest hunting camp on the banks, and this is. I don't know if any of you know Richard Gillikin from down on Harkers Island. This is his grandfather, Wardy Murphy. He was one of the guides and caretakers, and that's the camp behind it. This is the camp coming in. It had its own landing strip. Sometimes they would have fly-ins of lots of planes. I've seen pictures of biplanes and lots of other things. They had their own cook, and some of the locals have said when they were kids, if they got to go in there, said they'd just sit and stare at all the beautiful guns on the wall, because there were people who were well-to-do, and all the guns were shiny and beautiful. But, now, I mentioned Charles Styron as the guy who got me into this. Well, how are we for time?
Oh, we got all day.
Okay. See, Charles Perry Styron told me about his camp, and he had great funny stories about that, but I better not try to tell all of them. But to show you, this is how his camp looked, and then this is, it's called, people will call it Wibbs Creek. You can come in off of the number red 13. You come in along some of the sticks, get in here and to a deeper channel, and there were about 14 camps here. It used to be a fishing camp. People started building camps. It was like a family culture where families would go over. They would hunt, they would fish, but they also had a lot of family get-togethers there. And that's where Charles Perry Styron's place is. And then, as I say, you know, they all thought these places were precious, and they were. I would have thought they was precious too. This is in Charles Perry Styron's mom's house. On the saw, she has a painting of it. But inside her cabin, she painted herself on the cabinet doors shorebirds, which are pretty darn good. But this is Clay Fulcher's. He was like the third or fourth house from the water, and they call that their little camp because Clay's dad, Clay Jr., Clay was the third, and the rest of his family had a bigger camp further north that they nicknamed Pillsbury. It wasn't a Pillsbury, but they nicknamed it that. And this is just in his house is a watercolor of the big camp. So they had a big camp where the whole family was, and a little camp where it was his family. And he said that he spent 51 days in a row there one time with his mom after his dad passed. And, but June, if y'all know June Fulcher, a lot of you will, because she said as soon as school was out, she'd grab those kids and go, and she'd get over there and let the kids go, and it was just the best place for her to get away. But this was the artwork of their bigger camp, which is still standing, and they still have rights to it. Now, I live right around the corner from, there was Jewel Hamilton and Julian Hamilton, his father, and Jewel, the son, both were decoy carvers, and everybody says I could be able to hear the geese and ducks from my house if they were still there, that they raised waterfowl. But his camp is one that's among decoy carvers and hunters you hear spoken of. So to give you an idea of a more rougher hunting camp and not a millionaire from New York, this is called the Evergreens. And you can see the firewood piled underneath, somebody standing out front. There's a view inside they had propane tanks, so they had gas stoves. They would dig a little train, or every camp had a different method of looking at that. They would dig wells. Generally they could hammer a well down, a pipe down with a strainer on the end, less than 15 to 20 feet, and get water. Because underneath, as the water comes down onto the banks, the fresh water seeps through and makes like a bubble of fresh water, and the salt water is excluded. You've seen like water bubbles when water round up, so that it would keep like a little collection. So if you got your well in the right place, you can get water. But that's camp. This other pictures of the camp is them cutting firewood and stuff around that camp. So we're getting up we're on North Core Banks now. This is another hunting club, and I'd like to tell you about Judge Lambert Morris, who is a really good decoy carver, very desirable decoys if you can get them. Joe Bernie has his law license sprained and some branding tools and beautiful decoys of his. But this is his camp. This is the second camp, because the first camp, he was a judge, and somebody got mad at him and burnt his first camp. And there's a lot of simple justice around. But the funny thing about Judge Morris was that the clerk of court would come out to the courtroom and say, "Court will not be held today. Judge Morris is hunting. The hunting's good." Get all the way up to Portsmouth, there were the Styrens and the Braggs had well documented hunting clubs up at Portsmouth. There's a place up there called the T.T. Potter. Well, there was called the T.T. Potter House, but it was called Armtech more recently because Charles Armsfield, who invented a bunch of things in the textile world, bought this camp from T.T. Potter, who used to be was a Sinclair station on the Front Street, and he bought it. It had been a pub before that. At one time, Portsmouth had 11 pubs across the shore because they had so many ships coming in and out. He bought this from T.T. Potter, had it renovated by Sammy Ballou, and he would send his people from all his textile mills could come and go there to fishing season or hunt during hunting season, and one of the guides is still living, Leroy Godwin in Cedar Island, for 20 years was the caretaker of that. Well, he also, when he built that, he got a trailer, a big trailer, like a little mobile home, that, where this is probably a mile and a half from the beach, or, used to be a flat, and now a lot of it's underwater, so when they people wanted to go fish on the beach, it'd be a long ways to come take a break or get out of the sun or whatever. So he built a trailer type that they would tow over with the tractor. So this is the Potter house, and this is the trailer. And the trailer he gave to Earl Noe, and Earl Noe made it into his camp right across from Henry Piggott's place on Doctor's Creek. And and he added on to it. So Earl Mack, a lot of us knew, and Earl, his dad, was from their camp. Now, you see people in the Coast Guard around, don't you? You know about them, they're always on boats. Did you know that they had horses? During the war, they had to patrol the beaches, so this is the Coast Guard at Portsmouth on horses that they would ride up and down the beach to watch for those Germans. And now, since we're even though he's from Beaufort, you know him. So this is Charlie Valines, and Charlie had his house. He was a Corsair pilot in the war, and he built his living quarters over the top of his hangar. He had 2 planes down below, and he had his where the Coast Guard station at Portsmouth. He rented for $1 a year when they would do that, and he would fly people over there to fish. Now, if Jack Guthrie was here, this is Jackie Guthrie right here.
Jack
Gardner, thanks. Thank you. Getting older. But Jackie would fly with him a lot when he went over there. And they went fish and they didn't get much, and they get ready to leave. They were already taken off, and they saw this pond where the water had got trapped and a bunch of fish inside and landed. And started getting it with spears and everything. So they got all these fish, and then they left so late they had to call people to have them put cars up and down the runway so they could land. But it was the fabulous flying fisherman. But he didn't just take kids over. This is Governor Luther Hodges, and I have the name of one of the senators. Earl Mack's in the back of that. And they did geese hunting over there too. This is just another picture of a place on, you can see that the other way. Casey's Island, it's gone, but it was a really nice hunting camp there. I brought these pictures because Clay Fulcher impressed on me the fact that these banks were precious to multiple generations. So this is Clay as a boy, his dad, his grandfather, but this is him as a man with his sons and his grandson. That those generations have been at the same place on the banks, learning to live and to cherish the banks. And the last picture I'll send with it is the kids really enjoyed it. So they had a good time with it. Remember I said the Masons were connected from right after the Civil War with deeds and stuff down through there. And Joe Fulcher's family had land that was multi-generational on the banks. The German Holland had 460 acres. Dr. Moore had the Moore family had hundreds of acres. So a lot of the camps on the banks were, the names would be different, but there'd be more relatives. And yeah, so Suzanne Guthrie was talking to me yesterday. She said, near the end, people were coming from Pollocksville and off to buy some of the cabins from other people. And if the Park Service hadn't taken it over, they'd be coming from Raleigh condominiums. So yes, it was a good thing, but it really was heartbreaking. And maybe, so Jeff West would say, if he were here, he'd say a couple things that I think are real pertinent. The Park Service didn't choose to do it. They were told by Congress to do it. And he says they had to do it, but it could have been done a nicer way. It could have been done more sensitive to people, and But they came with a mandate to take this back to a wilderness. Now, Karen Einspacher's not here, but she had arranged a meeting of people from the Park Service from prior years, from last decades, actually from back when the Park Service started here. And they said that when they came, that they were really not like the kids were shoved in school. People actually threw Coca-Cola bottles at Park Service kids riding their bicycle down the road. We tried to run them off the road. It was really, it was on both. Anyways, it really became probably hard to turn around that fever. But I would say, even Joe Fulcher would say that Joe is crusty and so I don't like Park Service. So, but I guess if they hadn't done that, we'd be in a mess. You know, he'll eventually get around. Most people will get around to the point where they say, yes, for the best, because now anybody can see. When Clay Fulcher took me over to his camp, and I looked up the shore and down the shore, and it was nothing but waves and beach and sand. And where in America can you see that? It was a blessing. Then I don't know if y'all know that there were 3 attempts to develop the Cape. There was the Cape Lookout Land Company, the Cape Lookout Development Company. They both were going to take a railroad trestle, take it across to Shackleford, and run the railroad up Shackleford to the Cape and develop on the Cape. And in later years, after World War II, Charles Reeves, along with a few local people in Morehead City, planned an airstrip, 2 hotels, and subdivisions. Now they'd be pumping in a lot of sand and putting up a lot of rocks right now, but the people wanted to develop that. So at one hotel that's down on the point that washes in and out, and then one up not far from where the lighthouse is now, and then they're going to put a marina in there. So it really was nothing. Yeah.
It'd be like Nag's Head.
Well, we wouldn't have the chance to go see it in its pristine fashion, but there was I think I was told she's working on she does a lot of anthropological research and writing, so it's really great stuff that I'd love to read, particularly more on the mainland side. But Brian, is that correct that she's working on a novel about the porpoising and Tri-Yard?
Yeah.
Yeah. So she's across from Shell Island, a little further up. I'm not sure where it was. Brian, do you know where was it on an island out behind Cobb's Creek, or was it the porpoising stuff? But
There's porpoising all up down the banks, just like I was whaling.
Mhm.
In fact, there's an old tripod out in front of our house in the Straits.
Mhm.
It's probably for porpoising.
So they would catch whales, but porpoises too, and render the fat, get the oil, because they can make a living off of that. And where Cobb's Creek pier that's broken up now, they think they're fixing this. Off of that, I think is Tri-Yard Creek, and supposedly Tri-Yard's what Greater Keith Willis says that's where one of the porpoise rendering slants was. So. Did you know they hunted porpoises? It'd break my heart now.
Yeah.
Because if you get around the boat, sometimes they'll let you even touch them. They'll come up.
It wouldn't have broken your heart, though, if that's what put food on your table.
Yeah, well, I got to go with Dan Rinshoff to Singapore and for 17 days with Duke students to look at environmental things, and it became very clear. They lost all. The British pulled out, and they had to rebuild the whole country. Singapore has no water, nothing but rain. They have no water. They had to buy water from Malaysia, And everybody said, you ought to do this, you ought to do that for the environment. I said, we can't do anything for the environment till we have people water, shelter, and food. And it became, I was kind of naive thinking, no, till you sort of look at it that way, that survival has to come first, then you can start looking at making long-range choices.
So did your deed searches were they just in Carter County, or how did you do
How do I do deed searches?
that?
So I go down and talk to Miss Iona at the Register of Deeds, and she has. But yeah, you can go online. You can do online deed searches through their website by name, and you can bring them up, download them, or print them from your computer. And you go to, if you have a question, they're real helpful when I find something and I can't. If it's before 1900, then that's being digitized, but it's not digitized yet.
Are there King's grants over there, Stan? I've heard stories of, that go back.
Well, the Shackleford and I can't think of the other person, but they were given that as a King's grant, and then they split it, and Shackleford took the bottom part. They used it for grazing. And in fact, even in this century, there were a lot of sheep over there. When the Park Service took it over, like I say, there were sheep, goats, cattle. I remember when we moved down here, there was like longhorn cattle out there, sheep up on dunes. And they would, the Moore family raised sheep and sheared them every year. And Suzanne Guthrie said her husband Jack helped go over and do the shearing sometimes. But that's what Shackleford did. He said, well, I don't need to put up fences. And then back turn of the century, the woods went from the inlet to the cape. And they might have been narrow or not, but that's why they called it Lookout Woods, and they called it down in the city. But they were boat builders. They built their homes, they had firewood, and the incursion of salt water and the changes, they naturally were losing some forest areas. But Shackleford was very heavily forested.
Do you know anything about the pony roundups they did in the 50s and 60s?
Yeah.
They do it with jeeps. And they built a temporary corral.
No, so they did it with four-wheelers and three-wheelers.
But I have memories of it, but not clear memories, and I did.
So they would do it every year, and they would, when they didn't have those, they would just go up and down, banging on cans and stuff. But as soon as they were able to get three-wheelers, I have pictures of them doing the roundup, people on the three-wheeler. They're not great photos because one, people didn't go over there to take photos anyway, went over to have a good time, and two, cameras weren't that great back then, and for content. But they would start out at the end, and there'd be a few three-wheelers, and then kids would go and they'd be banging things and go in the brush and run them out. And they had the corral that had a fence coming up into the island, and if you see the picture of the corral, there's a fence coming up to the corral, and they would run them in to the corral, then they'd come from the other end, run them in the corral, then they would say, well, and people own those horses. They own them, and then so they got the colts, and then they would know whose colt and who's belonged to which colt, because they just leave them be and watch to see which colt stayed with which mom. Then that was that guy's or that family's horse. Now they just to say something funny, but it's true that at Portsmouth, after the guys took the brought ponies there, the ponies that stayed up around the village were real tame. So they'd take them and ride them to so there were horse pens on Shackleford, north of the Cape, and Portsmouth, maybe others. But they would run the horses from the Portsmouth to the Bay Marsh and all those ponies. They run them in and do whatever they're going to do. Those were tame up. Then they could ride them. They go down to the high hills, which is further south. Those horses were wild, and you could not get on them. They'd ride them. Then they go get the cattle. Then they get the sheep, and they even had a goose roundup. Because people could raise geese that they could sell to people to put out tethers for hunting decoys. And there was a guy who was a real master of looking after them. I can't remember his name, I've got it written down. But they would all herd them to his house on Portsmouth and put them in a pen, and he would get them all ready just to sell. But they had a goose hunt roundup every year.
Geese didn't fly?
Hmm?
They didn't fly?
No, I think they clipped their wings. What do you, is that what you, say again?
What went bone in there?
They clipped them, but they clipped them some way that they still could flutter and get away, but they couldn't, fly.
Well, there's a story about how chickens would know that a storm was coming. And they would come and go to the shore, and that's when the islanders would know to put the board up to the boat so the chickens could walk onto the boat to go over to Harkers Island.
Ah, cool. They,
Anybody ever heard that story?
I'm good.
so I've been told that, the people who lived over there, that when the storms were coming, that even a day ahead, the horses would gather and start putting head to head and would start gathering, and they would start thinking about, oh, something's happening, getting ready to happen. So that's a parallel story. And, they're good stories, whether they're true or not, or they're variational, but yeah.
And then I've often wondered how many of the homes were transported by boat from after the 1899 storm.
Yeah, and I don't know. I don't know that because I haven't tried to research the Exodus and the things about Diamond City, because I know that there've been so many the Promised Land folks doing research and history places. I bet they can tell you how many there, and folks in Harkers Island can tell you.